Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Food, Wine, and Whiskey in Your Own Backyard. I am Rob, your host, and on the show with me again today, Chris Ruhland. Chris, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Rob. How are you?
I'm guessing you're getting the hint that I like you.
Well, I like you too, Rob, and
enjoy having you on, man.
I love coming on. This is a lot of fun. As I've said before, I really love your podcast, and so for me to come on, it's an honor, and I really enjoy doing it.
Well, I appreciate you doing it. You know, you're just, when it comes to wine, you just have a tremendous amount of knowledge, and you being generous enough to let us kind of tap into that, I really appreciate that, and I know listeners who get to listen to this and kind of dip into that knowledge as well appreciate that, so thank you very much.
I'm happy to.
So we know, people who know you've heard you on the podcast know that you're a champagne guy. That's your love. That's, I would say, you tell me if I'm wrong, that's your number one wine.
I think that's right.
Okay.
That's fair to say.
So the topic tonight, people saw the title, Riesling, which I think is a fantastic grape, but can be a little bit, confusing if the average wine person is trying to get in and kind of get entry into that varietal and understand what's going on or what can go on with that grape. But I wanted to ask you, where does Riesling, because the more research I've done, I've found that this is a pretty well thought of grape. We talk about Cabernet and some of the other, really nice grapes around the world that have some, huge following as being a, really nice grape. Riesling's one of those. Where does this fall for you as far as your enjoyment of drinking this wine?
Well, I think I agree with a lot of people that Riesling is one of the greatest grape varieties there is. And certainly of the white grape varieties, it's one of the greatest. And there are some reasons for that we can get into. I mean, it's a very old grape. It's been cultivated in a lot of places. It's most well known as a grape from Germany. But there are some objective reasons why Riesling is great. And then there's the subjective reason, which is that I think it's delicious.
Sure.
So, but yeah, it's way up there as far as I'm concerned, and I know I'm not alone.
I've been trying to get into Riesling. Wasn't a grape that I was very familiar with, but I had a lot of friends here in the Houston area that we were doing some wine get-togethers, and there was a couple guys in particular that kept bringing bottles of Riesling and saying how great it was. And I would have a glass and go, hey, this is delicious. I'm obviously missing something here with not tapping into this varietal. And so I decided to start kind of getting into that lane a little bit. But doing that, I would have something at the dinner and then go buy something at the store, and it would be completely different because I had no idea what I should be looking for. And the more I kind of dug into this, I found out there is a very wide range of what you can get from Riesling.
That's true. And that's something that I think some people don't appreciate, although the way to appreciate it is to do exactly what you did, which is go to the store, buy a bunch of bottles of Riesling, take them home and drink them and see what the differences are. And we can talk about some of those differences today, and I'm sure we will, but one of the things about Riesling that is important and why it's so great is that it does express itself differently in different places. And again, I think most people are familiar with Riesling from Germany, and of course it's Germany's most grown grape variety, and most, I don't know about most by now, but the plurality at least of Riesling is grown in Germany. But even there is a diversity of styles. But certainly when you start talking about Australia and the Finger Lakes and the Columbia Valley and Alsace and on, you get a lot of different expressions of the grape variety, which is one of the things that I think is so wonderful about it, is it's just not one wine wherever you go.
So let me ask you this. Let's talk about where it can be grown, because you just named a few regions, and people who might not know, like the Finger Lakes is in the United States and Alsace is in France. It has a big kind of German influence on it. Would that be fair to say?
Well, certainly Alsace does. Alsace was, of course, part of Germany
right,
more than once.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, right. So there's that. But it is grown in a number of places. In fact, probably most people don't know that 50 years ago, there was more Riesling grown in California than Chardonnay.
Oh, is that right?
So yes, absolutely, and there are still some excellent examples of California Riesling. Um, and so, it, again, I mean, I think, and maybe to what you're getting at, where is it grown and why is it grown in certain places? I mean, I think one of the things about Riesling is that it is a grape that is hardy and tolerant of cold winters. It buds later to avoid spring frost, so it's very suitable for cold climates. So this is why you do see it in a lot of cold climates. On the other hand, you do see it in climates that aren't as cold, and you certainly wouldn't want to put it in a climate where it's baking in the sun all the way through the growing cycle. Uh, but it happens. But I mean, typically you're going to see it in a colder climate. I mean, the thing about the grape in terms of its growth, it can accumulate sugar without losing its naturally high acidity, and that's what's great about it. So you can get these different styles. It's a grape that is characterized by high acidity, which I think is one of the things that makes it a great food wine. But as it accumulates sugar over the growing season, particularly later in the growing season, you don't see that drop in acidity that you normally see, or as big of a drop as you normally might see in other grape varieties.
So, when you get into wine, when I got into wine, I didn't look for a specific region for a specific grape. I might try Cab in Napa, Cab in Chile, Cab in, Bordeaux. Is this a grape, a varietal that you think should they go to Germany first to really kind of understand what the grape is all about and what the expressions can be? Is it okay to start in California or Oregon or Finger Lakes?
I think it's okay to start anywhere. You're going to get, again, some different expressions, but Riesling, once you get to know it, um, you will be able to identify that it is in fact Riesling, no matter where it comes from. That there are certain markers to it, and so it's not like your mind's going to be completely blown probably by a Riesling uh, that is from a particular region. But on the other hand, um, yeah, I think you can start anywhere, and I think but I think the thing to do is what you did really is to maybe start three different places. Start with three different dry Rieslings, for example, from three different places, and see what the differences are. And I can talk about some of those if you'd like. But and of course, Germany, there's a lot of Riesling, a lot of great German producers who have been producing Riesling for a long time, who are experts at it. I still do believe in expertise in winemaking, and in Germany, in some cases, you're talking about hundreds of years with certain producers. And the other thing about Germany is that you have lots of different expressions of sweetness levels. So, when people talk about sweet Riesling, they sometimes say it as if that's one thing, but it's not. There are degrees of sweetness, and you can experience that very well in Germany, I think,
Yeah,
by trying different types of wines.
now you just got on kind of why I was asking that question, because I think Germany also does a very good job, what I'm finding early on, in letting the consumer know what type of, I don't know if type's the right word, but what style of Riesling you're getting as far as sweetness on the label. And to me, with wines around the world, you get used to a particular region, whether it's Napa, and typically they'll tell you, the grape on the label. You might go to Old World, where it's typically the region will tell you what kind of grapes are going to be in the wine. Riesling can be a little bit confusing on the sweetness level of what you're getting in that bottle. Now, if you don't know or understand kind of the degrees of how that goes, it can be a little bit confusing for consumer.
Well, yeah, it's funny you say that because I think historically Germany has not done a great job explaining to the consumer what the sweetness level is. I think there are some aspects in which it's gotten better, but there are aspects that remain that really are confusing at best, honestly, because they don't really tell you very much. You actually have to figure a lot of it out for yourself. There are some labels now where, in fact, I have a which one do I have here? This is actually one from the Eden Valley that I have, that's in Australia, where it says this Riesling is dry, and then it has a little chart: medium dry, medium sweet, and sweet. And those 3 boxes are not checked, and the dry box is checked. And things like that are helpful, but it's actually a little more complex in Germany, because you have these categories, and that's might be what you're referring to, the Prädikat categories.
Yes.
Those don't actually indicate sweetness for the most part. They can give you a hint about sweetness, and in some cases they do. At the very top level, if you're talking about Trockenbeer and Auslese, that's the TBA wines, which are the sweetest. You know those are sweet. But if you're talking about the Cabernet and Spätlese and Auslese, those tell you something, which we can discuss, but they don't actually tell you how sweet the wine is going to be.
They don't. Okay. So labeling to me was a big thing, is always a big thing, to try to get as much information as I can about what I might be buying, and to kind of have some idea formed in my mind of what I'm going to get out of this wine. And so how does one know? How do you
well,
it's just like you said,
together.
Just kind of keep drinking and take some notes.
Well, right. So there, I can, if you want me to do this, I think it's probably helpful just to talk at a basic level. I think we skipped some stuff about the grape and stuff and all these other things, but that's okay since you brought it up. If you want to talk about some of the German wine labeling terms, I'm happy to do that. Some of the basic ones that might get to, and how you might figure out sweetness in a German Riesling.
Yeah, let's do that real quick, because I think that would be great information.
So there are some fundamental things, and unfortunately, again, a lot of these things, there are these circles that overlap like a Venn diagram, but there are some things where you can tell what the sweetness is. So if you see the word Trocken, or they're moving to the term selection, either Trocken or selection, that is going to be dry or a little bit off dry potentially. Okay, so that is a reliable way to find a dry wine, is to see the word Trocken. If you see Halbtrocken or classic on a label, that's going to be off dry. There's going to be some residual sugar, that's noticeable, somewhere between maybe 12 or 18 grams of residual sugar. There's a category of medium sweet that you don't see very often, and then there's a category, it's spelled S-U-S-S, sus, which that's very sweet. That's over 45 grams of residual sugar. So now you're talking about a sweet wine. Those terms are, I guess, the easiest way. If you see those on the label, which you might not, but if you do, those can point you in the right direction. The terms that I think are somewhat misunderstood are the so-called Prädikat levels. And so we need to back up a little bit, but there are basically 4 different categories in Germany of wine classifications that get to quality in some sense. So there are 2 kinds of wines that you're really not going to see very much in the United States, and that's Deutscher wine, which is wine that can come from anywhere in Germany. There's Landwein, which comes from a smaller area, if you're familiar with like PGI wines in Italy. And then there's Qualitätswein, which is a higher category, which is, now you're talking about the wine came from one of 13 quality wine regions in Germany, like the Mosel, for example. Okay. Now, the highest level is this Prädikatswein, and you will see this a lot on shelves in the United States. They're not necessarily super expensive. You could find Prädikatswein that's $30 or $40, but Prädikat is like means distinction. So these are wines of distinction. Now, within Prädikatswein, okay, and this is about as deep as I'll go, unless you want me to go deeper, there are these levels that we started to talk about, like Cabernet and Spätlese and Auslese. These are not sweetness terms. These are terms that relate to the essentially the must weight, which is like the concentration of solids in the grape or in the grape must. So if you're familiar with the term bricks, in the United States use this term bricks
Sure.
to measure. Okay, so there's a it's called Excla in Germany, but it's a different measurement device. And what this is saying is, because in Germany, it was always typically hard to ripen grapes, so the emphasis was put not on place but on must weight. Like the more must weight you had, that meant in some sense the higher quality of the wine. So how long do they have these grapes ripened? So typically the first grapes that are picked in the Pradikats vine are called Cabinet, and these are like the September harvest grapes, okay? And these are usually dry, but not always. Then you have Spätlese, and these are grapes that are picked maybe 1 to 2 weeks later, and they've got more, again, sugar, but potential alcohol in the grapes. These can be dry, but they can also be, medium sweet. And then Auslese which means select harvest. These are picked a little bit later. And now typically you're starting to get, these can be dry, but now you're starting to get sweet. So it's some indication, but again, what it is, that these are just really about how much potential alcohol these grapes have. And then the last three categories are sweet wines. So Beer and Auslese, Trockenbeer and Auslese, and then ice wine. Okay, they're going to be sweet wines. But what the winemaker does, they harvest these grapes and they decide, well, how dry or sweet do I want to make this? And that's when you introduce sulfur to stop fermentation, right? If you don't want to make a dry wine. And so that's a long way of saying that you can't reliably tell how sweet a wine is, but it gives you some indication. If you take those terms and then look at the alcohol level, you can determine whether you're looking at sweet wine, probably.
Because I'm guessing there could be some overlap. You could have...
Right, there is overlap, sure.
Yeah.
Yes. So, there's overlap in terms of different producers. So one producer's, Auslese could have the same amount of sweetness as another's Spätlese, right?
Right.
And so that's not because when you have the ability to terminate fermentation through sulfur generally, and you create an 8% alcohol wine, let's say, that's you're going to have a sweet wine, and because you're going to have more sugar than the grape that weren't fermented to dryness. And so that's really what we're talking about. So the way you do this, in my mind, unless you want to investigate each producer in Germany and see exactly what's going on, look at the reviews, but if you're in the store, and the thing to do is to look at the terms Cabinet, Spätlese, and Auslese, and compare that to the alcohol in the back. Okay. So if you see a Cabinet wine, okay, you might think to yourself, I think like you were thinking, oh, that's dry. But what if you look at the back label and it's 8% alcohol? What does that tell you? It's probably off dry, or medium dry. There's some residual sugar in that wine. So that's the way, I think, to figure it out.
Okay, that seems very low, 8% when you give that example, because I hadn't even thought about that. I thought as you were talking, I was thinking, well, you could look at the alcohol and that would be some indication of sweetness on it. But 8% seems awfully low. I would have thought that would have been very dry, but it could be off dry.
No, because again, the lower the alcohol, the more likely a German wine is, in these examples, is to be sweet.
So we right? kind of went over the Cabinet and the Spätlese. So what would you say for a dry wine would be what level of alcohol from?
So a dry wine would be somewhere, again, depending on if you're talking about
just roughly.
So talking about a Cabinet wine, for example, 11% would probably be dry.
Okay.
Right? Because it's one of the earlier harvested grapes, right? Fermented to dryness, maybe it only ferments to 11%.
Okay.
Right? So whereas if you took an Auslese that was 11%, and actually usually they're lower, but let's just say you found one like that, that might have a little residual sugar, right? Because it's picked later, it was greater potential alcohol, right? Greater concentration of sugars in the grapes when picked, and
Okay.
therefore, if you assume that it wasn't fermented to dryness, and that's probably not it's probably, we were probably looking at it as like a 9% or 8% or something like that. You're talking about a wine that you've got to imagine was not fermented to dryness, right?
Okay.
And therefore, there's going to be residual sugar.
Okay. For me, that's just been the hardest part, is understanding what I'm going to get in the sweetness level when I get home. So it sounds like it's really a combination of understanding the style, the spot lazy, when it was harvested, and then looking at the alcohol in the back. Those two have to go hand in hand.
Yeah, unless you know some other way what the residual sugar is. What would be great is if they just put what the residual sugar was on the label, right? Or if even, I mean, to me, I would love to see the residual sugar on the label. That just helps me know how sweet it is. But again, with this, you see this now more and more, these labels that have a little sliding scale chart on them. And they'll say like dry, medium sweet, and sweet. And then there'll be a little X where the producer thinks the wine is. Those are helpful too, right? Because you can see, okay, this, maybe if it's medium sweet, it's not the sweetest, but it's going to have some sweetness to it. That would provide some assistance as well.
So let's go back to, I know we're kind of jumping back and forth here, but I think it's different we're talking about labeling a little bit, but by region, there's no consistency, right? Germany does it their way. Are these terms used in other regions? The cabinet, the spot lazy?
They are. Austria uses them, but they use them in a slightly different way.
Okay.
But yeah, now you're starting to get to a situation that becomes very confusing. And so I think what is good is that there has been a trend lately, especially outside of Germany, for producers to just tell you this is dry or this is sweet. I mean, especially in the New World, you see this all the time. For example, Chateau Saint Michel, which produces more Riesling than anybody else in the world, in Washington, they have bottles that say dry Riesling, sweet Riesling. I mean, that's very helpful. Now we know, right? And so I think it's improving in some sense, but I think there are always going to be, especially higher end producers, I think, who feel like that's not what their customers really want to see. Like their customers are more sophisticated in some way, and I don't know. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen.
That's the snobbiness in the wine world. Is that what you're saying?
You think there might be some of that every once in a while, right? And so, but it's very confusing, and it's not more than confusing. A lot of things that are on labels just aren't helpful, and so you kind of have to mess with it and play with it a little bit. Now, if I buy an Auslese German wine, I expect it's going to be sweet. There are not a lot of those at this point that are dry, and in fact, there are organizations or producers who've gotten together who've decided, okay, we're going to, make sure that something like that doesn't happen, like that, that certain wines will be, will meet expectations.
Okay.
Essentially.
Well, and I just wanted to bring that up because I for me, it's been very confusing trying to figure out what I'm getting. And I didn't know if maybe I was just not understanding what I was seeing on the labels, and that's part of it. But the other part of it is, it sounds like there's just not the information we all need as consumers on the label a lot of the times. Yeah,
there isn't. So, for example, to just provide some meat on the bones, what I was just talking about. So the most prestigious organization, I think most prestigious wine growers organization in Germany is the VDP. You can see their initials on bottles and their logo of an eagle with a bunch of grapes. And they their product cut levels are for sweet wines. So if it's dry, it's going to say Qualitätswein trocken, and you'll know that's dry. And then when you get into Spätlese, you'll know that there is some residual sugar. So there's some of that, but again, how would anybody know that?
Yeah.
It's just not obvious on the labels, and this is a problem all over the wine world, I think, right? The labels are terrible. I mean, they just don't inform the consumer what's in the bottle, and on a number of different fronts. We're talking all about residual sugar. That's all we're talking about right now. But there's all sorts of things that are in the wine or aren't in the wine and aren't explained very well on labels. And I think it's improving and has improved, but there's a long way to go.
Yeah, because my episodes, obviously I'm a novice, and this is as much me gaining knowledge as the listeners who are listening to this episode. And so, it's hard for me, and again, I say I'm a novice, but I've been doing, wine for a few years now, but it's just very, very hard to go to the store and actually know what I'm getting. I won't lie. I've been getting a wide range of wines from the Rieslings that I've been buying, but I've
Yeah.
enjoyed them all. And you've been a great guide and kind of let me know what I'm getting and kind of what I should be eating with those types of wines and things like that, which I thought was very interesting. But let's go back to the grape. I know that we kind of jumped to labels because I thought that was an important part to get into first because it's kind of confusing. Get that out of the way. But back to the grape itself. You had some other notes that you wanted to mention about this particular grape.
Well, because we were talking about its objective greatness, and I think that's where I left off. What's interesting about Riesling is that it has very high acidity, and typically high acidity, and high levels of flavor intensity or high levels of extract. And when you combine those two things, you're talking about the potential for a very long-lasting, powerful, significant wine. And so
By long-lasting, you mean aging.
Right, exactly, aging. Yeah, yeah. Because wines don't have great flavor concentration are wines that are not candidates for long aging for the most part. And wines that are low in acidity, may age or may not, but it's the combination of those two things means that the wine can taste fresh, for many years or decades after it's been bottled, and of course it'll change, right? It'll develop, and so that's one of the great things about Riesling. Riesling also, is very aromatic, and I think especially with white grapes, we really divide white grapes between non-aromatic white grapes like Chardonnay and aromatic grapes like Riesling. And so it's very perfumed, it's very fruity, it's very floral, it can be. It can be spicy and mineral, and just a lot of different aromas that you can smell and then eventually taste in Riesling. So there's just a lot of objective greatness, as I would say, to this grape variety. And then when you start getting into it, again, it's very delicious, and there's a lot of diversity.
So when you talk about the the levels of sweetness and minerality, and is it by producer and is it by the style that they're doing when they're harvesting the grapes, or can this change year to year based on weather and things like that? How much does all of the terroir and everything play into what you get each year from the grape?
Well, so both is the
Okay.
answer, right? Because again, assuming that you have a vineyard or a series of vineyards of Riesling and you have good weather conditions, you can decide when to harvest these grapes. Obviously, you don't want to harvest unhealthy grapes, rotten grapes. It could rain, lots of things could happen. But let's say that you have good conditions at harvest. With Riesling, what you can do is you can extend the the harvest time for some of the grapes. And so that allows you to create different styles. Also, Riesling is susceptible to botrytis. I don't know if that's something you've talked about before, but
I haven't.
botrytis.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's a fungus that leads to either gray rot, which is really bad, or noble rot, which is really good, where it desiccates the grape and concentrates grape sugars. And this is how we get, most famously, probably we get Sauterne, right?
Okay.
Is through this process. But you need certain climatic and weather conditions for that to happen. In particular, you need foggy, like misty, cool mornings, and you need dry afternoons. But you also need grapes that are susceptible to botrytis, particularly thin-skinned white grapes, and which Riesling is. So again, that's another thing when you're talking about the highest level of sweetness, TBA wines in Germany. They have almost all these, or the vast majority, would have been infected with botrytis and hand selected for that reason, becoming very sweet wines. Again, if that's a possibility in that vintage year, right? If a producer wants to do it, and if there's enough, these are rare wines. Now you're talking about rare and somewhat expensive. Some of these German TBAs can be incredibly expensive. But to answer your question succinctly, yes, the sweetness level depends on what the producer wants to do, and then what the producer can do in terms of harvest.
And so, we think about most wine regions, they harvest every year. They get something typically, unless, there's just something weather-wise that prevents them from being able to harvest either early on with frost or something like that, or too much rain, or whatever the case might be. Is this pretty consistent? Do we have harvest every year? Or is this a grape where it's so, kind of tricky with all the elements that it's playing with, that there are years where they don't harvest as much because it just didn't get to where it needed to be with the must or whatever it might be?
Well, it depends. I mean, first of all, that question gets to a lot of issues,
Okay.
including whether, for example, you harvest earlier and you chaptalize, add sugar to the grape must, which is permitted for some levels of German wine, for example, and not others. It gets to the question of whether you don't have enough residual sugar, so you add Sous Reserve, which is unfermented grape juice at the end of the process to make it sweet. So there are various corrections that can be made to wine when you don't have a great growing season. That's one answer. The other answer is, yeah, sure, there are years where harvests get wiped out because of weather conditions. I think, interestingly enough, again, if we're talking about Germany, they've probably to some extent been helped by climate change in that regard, right? With warmer temperatures, allowing for more consistent growing seasons. Now, all that said, again, we shouldn't just focus on Germany because, again, this grape variety is grown in lots of different places. And so the conditions, the climates, and the weather would be different in all those places.
So when we talk about Riesling and the harvest season, and we talk about, you're in early harvest, you're in late harvest, or medium, what is the timeline? Most people think about wine and here in the States, everybody kind of knows about Napa, and they start thinking late September into October. You're starting to get into what they call crush over there, and everybody's starting to harvest and, start getting everything into vats and all of that. What's the harvest season when we say, late harvest versus early? What are we looking at? What's the length of time between to let it hang on the vine?
Well, it could be significant depending on what you're doing. Again, if we're talking about Germany, I think this is really what we are talking about for the most part.
Yeah, I think so.
This. Okay, so again, you could start, and let me just say that not everybody makes all these styles, right? There some focus on one, some or the other. But let's say you were going to harvest for all these styles, which would be somewhat unusual. But if you're going to do that, you might start the cabinet grapes harvested in, let's say, September. You might a couple weeks later harvest the Spätlese. You might a couple weeks later, harvest Auslese, and it's a bit, again, it depends on the concentration of dissolved compounds in the grape juice, right? Because there actually are parameters in the law of where they have to be in terms of the ranges.
Okay.
So you'd have to measure that before you harvested, and then Baron Auslese would be later, Trocken Baron Auslese would be later, and there'd be botrytis, and then ice wine. These are grapes that have to be frozen.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So in Germany, you can't pull off grapes and then go take them somewhere and throw them in a freezer. So they're going to be frozen and stay frozen. So you're talking about pretty late, right?
Yeah.
If you did that, which is why you see that if you were to go out to the store, to your local wine shop, you probably wouldn't find a TBA wine.
Okay.
You'd have to look pretty hard because the quantities are limited and they're expensive. But in any event, yeah, it could be a long series like that, leading all the way to ice wine.
Okay, and I'm asking these questions because, we're talking, I know we're kind of focusing on Germany, but I think that's kind of where this all started, and I'm going to call them the kings of this grape. I mean, they make it as well or probably better than everybody else. I think everybody tries to stylistically follow them. But when you go to other regions then, whether it be, other New World regions, other Old World regions, are they trying to do a similar type of method when they talk about harvest and all of that? It's all about the sugars, or
not
is
necessarily?
It, okay?
Not necessarily. I mean, that's the thing, because when you said that with Germany, I would agree that it's the oldest Riesling wine growing region. It's the largest today, but I wouldn't say that everybody's trying to do what Germany is doing, because again, stylistically, there are some very different wines. I mentioned before we start, I have 3 different Rieslings right here in front of me that I poured for myself. I have one from Alsace, one from Australia, and one from the Finger Lakes. And if you were here, you smelled these, you would see that they are all quite different. They share a commonality, and these are all dry, by the way, but they're different. And so what I think is exciting about wine in general and Riesling in particular is I love the diversity of it, and that's what's fun about it. Why would we want to open an Australian Riesling from the Eden Valley and find out that, oh, this is just exactly like the German wine we had the other day? I think there are some that are similar, like some of these Rieslings from the Finger Lakes, for example, are incredibly floral and mineral, and they can remind you of particular wines from a particular region in Germany. But if you go next door to Alsace, for example, I think you see a slightly different style in the dry wine. So my thing would be to encourage people again to see for themselves, just to know. What I can tell you is that I've had a lot of these from all over the world, and they're all really interesting and great. Maybe they're not all great, because I want to say that every bottle of wine I've had is great, but they're interesting, and the diversity itself is interesting, right? Just to be able to see how this grape variety can express itself differently in a different area and in someone else's hands. I think it's pretty cool.
Well, I love that about it. Absolutely. So it makes me ask the question, when you're a consumer, how do you know if you've got a good Riesling or a bad Riesling? Is it based on the acidity that's in the wine, or is that going to be a big kind of factor in how you judge that wine?
So let me just make sure I understand your question. If you want to know if it's good or bad before you buy it or after you buy it?
Well, probably after you buy it, right? But you get it home, and because it can be such a wide range of what you get out of a bottle, you might be able to open up a cab from any region and know if it's a good cab or a bad cab. Or not everybody makes great wine, right? Some people are trying to make Riesling. So how do I know as a consumer, if I get a Riesling from wherever, to not judge it and go either it's think it's bad, but it's actually probably pretty good, or vice versa. Think it's good and it may not be so good. How do you know when you're drinking that? What are you looking for?
Well, so I can answer that in a couple ways. I mean, one is that you look at it the same way you look at any other wine, and so it takes some intentional training to some extent to be able to understand what is a quality wine and what isn't, and what wines are on the spectrum and how. But traditionally, the traditional factors that people look at are balance, length, complexity, and then arguably intensity or concentration, and also typicity. So that's what you would apply to any wine. Is it typical, right? Is this clearly Riesling, or does somehow somebody make something that tastes like Chardonnay? And that's one thing. And the other thing is it balanced? Is the acidity and balance with the flavor concentration, for example? And is it long? How long do the pleasant flavors remain in your mouth after you swallow the wine? That to me is an incredibly important component. And then the complexity, is there a lot going on, or is it a one-dimensional wine? So that's what I would say.
I think
about
it's a
all
great
these,
answer. Yeah.
So that's that. And then of course, with Riesling, I mean, I just think that Riesling should have at least the medium plus type acidity. If you get a Riesling that is like medium or even low acidity, that's problematic, and that would just again show up in the way you look at the wine through all the factors I mentioned. But typically, well, for example, I'll take one that again, probably the most sold Riesling is Chateau Saint Michel. It's $10 on the shelf, and in some places probably 8 or 9. And there are millions of bottles produced by Chateau Saint Michel, and you should try it. It's not the greatest wine probably that you've ever had, but when I taste that wine, I think to myself, okay, if I had a choice, if I were at a restaurant, I had a choice between that wine and a similarly priced Pinot Grigio, for example, what would I be happy with? And to me, there's no question in the world I would take the Chateau Saint Michel every day of the week, because while it's not super complex, it is very balanced. It's very pleasant, has a very pleasant finish, unlike some bad Pinot Grigios that can be very bitter on the finish and totally disjointed. And so, quality is relative sometimes to other wines in the price category and where you are and the moment you're in, right? If you're at our favorite restaurant, Chili's, I don't know what they have there, but something like that, you got to start looking around at options. So
I think that's a great point. Yeah. But you bring up price, and that you're talking that can be a $10 wine. This is a very difficult question to ask, but there is no floor for quality. There is no, you need to spend, because I know when we talked about champagne and we did that episode, you kind of gave a floor. You need to be around this range to know that you're getting a quality product, or you should be getting a quality product.
Yeah. And champagne is in somewhat of a different category because it is so expensive to produce. And so if you're not producing $40 a bottle of champagne, you're cutting corners somewhere that's going to show up in the wine most likely. Now, with respect to wines that are still wines, of course, obviously, great material affects price, right? Because there are some very expensive grapes in Napa and grapes that aren't as expensive in the Central Valley of California. Same grape variety could be significantly different, and there's a reason, and it's just because of the quality of the grapes. So the question of whether there's a floor is hard to say. I mean, the other issue about more inexpensive wines is that, first of all, a lot of them are sold. That if you you look at the statistics on wine sales in the United States, the average price of a bottle of wine is a lot lower than you would probably think it is. It's like $7.
Yeah.
And so there's demand for it. And these aren't necessarily wines I'm drinking very often, but they're engineered for price, and they're engineered for taste. Now, what you're going to not have probably is you're not going to have probably very long wines. You're not going to have very complex wines, but it'll be wine.
Okay.
And, you know, but yeah, no, I mean,
I
in
knew
general,
it was a tough question because, different regions can be just so different in cost, but
let me just to put myself out on a limb a little bit more. I mean, when you're talking about Riesling, I definitely believe that you can find very, very good Rieslings for $20. Okay. In fact, the wines I have here, this Trimbach is one of the greatest producers in Alsace. They make a Riesling Clos Saint Hune, which is an incredibly expensive, hard to find Riesling. But they also make something they just label Riesling, and it's somewhere between $18 and $20. I have it right here, and I think it's really good.
yeah.
I think it's, and not only think it's really good, I think it's very typical of Alsatian Riesling. These Finger Lake Riesling, same thing, $20, and just absolutely gorgeous. I mean, I actually think, the Finger Lakes, just to move around a little bit, is where you get a lot of value, is because to me there are $20 Finger Lakes Rieslings that they don't seem like they're $20, seem like
really?
They're $40. Yeah. Oh yeah.
So and you have one, so are you finding these? They're distributed, they make their way.
Yeah, you can get there are producers, there are lots of I have them, and you can go to
any big box
as
store.
I live in I live in Austin, and you can go to Specs, for example.
Okay.
And
Total Wines, things like that.
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, Total Wine, I think, is more difficult, arguably, and I haven't figured out the code on this, but I mean, somehow when I go for something like Rieslings for different places, I more tend to go to Specs. I just think they have a better selection.
Really?
Or something like that. Whereas other things, I go to Total Wine. So I don't know if I'm right about all these little micro decisions I make about where to go, but Specs, at least where I live, has an entire section just labeled Riesling, and they have Rieslings from all over the world, and it's pretty cool. So, you can find these. I mean, I've found all these here.
Are you ready to dive into what I think is going to be your favorite part of discussing this particular wine?
Sure.
You know what it is, right?
I don't, but I
food pairings. I'm assuming that I'm not even assuming. I know you think, or this is a fantastic food wine.
It is absolutely a fantastic food wine, and I want to get into that. But let me just preface this by saying this, because I don't think you and I have really discussed this much, but I do think this is very important when you talk about food pairing, because it's important to know what a person's assumptions about food and wine pairing are. It would be like talking to somebody about politics and not knowing where they stand politically and then accepting what they say as truth. So, because there are a lot of divergent thoughts about food and wine pairing. And so I'll just tell you where I stand. I mean, so, there's a train of thought. In fact, I have books, there are entire books written about this, that food and wine pairing can get very granular in terms of what's a better wine. I have a book right here that literally, if you look up lobster, it has different preferred wines for grilled, roasted, and steamed lobster from different villages in Burgundy. I mean, that's how specific this book gets.
Yeah.
Okay? And so there's a theory that you need to get down to that level of detail. I don't subscribe to that theory, but again, some people do, but I don't.
I appreciate that you don't.
Yeah. And then there's the opposite of the spectrum. There are very smart people. You can look on the internet who are very experienced in wine, and their idea is that food and wine pairing is complete bullshit. It makes no sense, and that you should just grab whatever wine you want with whatever food you're eating, and that's going to be fine. And that's that theory, and that's a reasonable theory. It's not one I subscribe to either. So I'll tell you what I believe something different. I think it's important because, again, I could just start saying things about food and wine pairing, but would it matter if you didn't know where I was coming from?
And I think that's a great point because, even for me, I like to try to pair foods with wines because I'm learning. And I think if somebody tells me that a particular meal is going to be enhanced by having this wine with it and vice versa, then I want to try to experience that. And that's right. All. I'm not getting down to the granular. And I might try a certain suggestion that somebody makes to me, a recommendation, and go, yeah, I didn't see it. I didn't get it. I prefer what I was drinking with that, whatever. Right. But I just want, so people who are out there going, okay, what would I eat with this? Just to kind of get in as, like you said, this is your palate, what you like with these wines, and your suggestions. Yeah. If you did eat food with these, what would you eat?
Yeah, but right. And just again, just very briefly before I say that, I just want to say I do have a theory of wine and food pairing, though.
Okay.
Which is another strain, which is also very common, and this is the one I happen to subscribe to, which is, and you can experiment yourself, and everybody I think should do this. The issue is that food is going to affect your perception of the wine in your mouth. You put food in your mouth, it is going to make your taste buds adapt to what comes next, and that is what's important. So trust me, if you take lemon juice and put it in your mouth and grab a wine, the lemon juice will do something, or tomato sauce, anything acidic, will do something to that wine. If you put something sugary in your mouth, something sweet, try having a sweet wine and then get like a Barolo and see what happens to that. Get a piece of candy, put it in your mouth, spit it out, and then taste the Barolo. It will taste very different from if you didn't have that sweetness in your mouth.
It's science.
So it's and everybody, and you can see this. So essentially, the bottom line is sweetness and umami, like asparagus or eggs, they will make wine taste harder in some way. Astringent, bitter, less sweet, less fruity. And so for these foods, you need a sweeter, fruitier wine. And this is, again, so let's jump in right there with Riesling. What is it? It's fruity. It can be sweet. This is one of the reasons if you're going to have a sauce, like a sweet sauce on duck, for example, you're going to want, to some extent, a wine that will hold up to that sweetness and be a little bit sweeter. Chili heat has a similar effect, and it also increases the burning effect of alcohol in wine. So this is where we get to spicy foods. Take a spicy food, put it in your mouth, take a really delicate, beautiful red Burgundy, and see what happens to it. It's going to make the wine less pleasant than it was before. This is why wines that, again, are sweeter will work with that. And on the opposite side, if you put salt or acid in your mouth, salty or acidic foods, they decrease the perception of acidity. Okay, and to me, acidity is really important in wine because it's what refreshes. This is why we drink something with food. We want to refresh. So here, Riesling has high acidity. So Riesling can take that hit to the acidity, right, with a salty or acidic food and still be okay. Where if you had a low acid wine, something like Viognier, for example, this, you could potentially start to taste flabby and flat. Fatty and oily foods do the same thing. They can make a wine seem less acidic. So what all this adds up to is that Riesling is an awesome food wine because we look at what food does to wine, and there's some Riesling somewhere at some level of sweetness that's going to be able to adapt and mix well with that food. And so that's why it's not like there's one Riesling that's best with one food, but if I have, anytime we have spicy, Asian food, Indian food, Mexican food, we are going sweeter side of Riesling. Because I know, and I'm particularly affected by spicy foods. Like I don't have a super high tolerance for it. So if I try to have a dry wine with a really spicy food, it just annihilates that wine. Now with a lighter fish dish or something like that, you might have a dry Riesling, but experiment with it. But I think that's where I come down, is that there are so many effects of food. real world effects that you can try for yourself. You can just take some salt, put it in your mouth, take a wine, see what happens. Take some lemon juice, put it in your mouth, take a wine, see what happens. There are real effects that will guide you toward what kind of wines you might want to drink. And so going back to my book that was so specific about these wines, if you look at the section on Riesling, and I'm not identifying this book because I actually like the book and I'm kind of criticizing a little bit, but I don't want to. But you go in this book, what to pair with Riesling. It's pages on pages where basically it's everything. I mean, it's like apples, Asian food, cheese, chicken, curries, duck, fish, fruit, ham, pork, salad, salmon, on and on. I mean, it's funny because, and I think this is where they're right in this book, that there are Rieslings that work with lots of different foods. Okay. So that's a very long answer.
No, but I think it's a good one. It shows that, if you're not sure what to pair with something, if you grab a Riesling, you're probably going to be pretty safe, as long as you grab the right one, I guess.
Right.
Yeah. So, well, what else about this grape and this varietal before we close out the show? Is there anything else you'd want the listeners to know about this or think about when they start diving into Rieslings and exploring this grape?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've talked a lot about it. One of the things we haven't talked about is that petrol note that you get in Riesling, or you can get.
Very common, yeah.
That's something that comes up a lot that people want to talk about.
How do you feel about that? Do you like that? I like it. Okay, me too.
I like it, but I like it in balance. So again, I think it's a flaw if you open a young German Riesling and you get this predominantly, and you don't get the peaches and flowers and other things, and that to me is an unbalanced wine. I think it makes a wine interesting, especially as a wine ages to notes of honey and toast, and if you get that little note of petrol, I find it interesting.
Yeah.
But that's something for people to experiment with and see what they think. And then I just think that there are so many great wine regions going Riesling and doing it so well, and producers in places that again people wouldn't necessarily look to, California and Australia. It's not the first thing that might come to some people's minds.
Yeah.
But check it out, because there's a lot of good stuff out there.
Well, let's close on this. Do you have two or three? I don't want to dive deep into producers because that's a rabbit hole. But two or three, if you have four, great, producers that are distributed very well, for the most part globally, that if you went out and wanted to look for a quality Riesling, these would be, a name that you should look for. And if you can find it, you're going to get something pretty good in the bottle.
Yeah, I think so. And I don't know if I could speak globally, but certainly in the United States.
Okay.
There are some high quality German producers to start there who are pretty widely distributed that you should be able to find. If you can't find all four of these I'm going to mention, you could probably find at least one, but there would be, in my mind, and there are others, so I'm probably excluding some, so if anybody, I'm leaving out their favorites, I'm sorry, but these are the ones that I just thought of that you see on the shelves, and that people, if they buy them, they can feel reliably that they're going to get a quality wine. So I would say Dr. Lozen, Willie Schaefer, J.J. Prum, and then Donhoff. And Donhoff, might be a little more expensive, and J.J. Prum is a little bit more on the expensive side. But those are, I've never had any of those that I thought were poor wines. Let's put it that way. And then Alsace, I mentioned Trimbach. I mentioned, well, in New York, Dr. Constantin Frank, or just Dr. Frank, makes just beautiful wines in the Finger Lakes. California, Smith Madrone makes Rieslings that are, I think, on the richer side to some extent, but I think are really beautiful.
I have a question. Does Chateau Saint Michel, do they make a higher end Riesling?
They do. They do.
Okay.
And so they make different levels of, not when I was talking about the $9, $10, talking about their basic one. But again, even the basic one, which they make in both sweet and dry, and it'll just say dry Riesling or sweet Riesling. And I think it's the same price or about the same price. again, it's not going to be a wine that you're going to say is maybe the greatest wine you've ever had, but what I like about it is that it's, again, for the price and in its competition, I think it's pretty good. But yes, they do make some higher end wines.
Well, I'm looking forward to going out and trying to find that Finger Lakes. Is it Dr. Frank?
Dr. Frank, yeah.
Yeah, I want to find one of his wines because I'm curious. I've never had a wine from the Finger Lakes, and if you're speaking pretty highly of them, I definitely need to give it a shot.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing that, again, I think is fun about this is that we all, I think sometimes, including me, sometimes get stuck on certain producers that I like and or certain regions, and it's just fun to explore.
Absolutely. Chris, I appreciate you coming on and doing another episode with us.
Thanks, Rob. I love being here.
Been a lot of fun, and we appreciate you sharing your knowledge, and probably going to hit you up again for another wine from over in that region. You know which one I'm talking about? Another grape? Starts with a G.
In which region are we?
Germany, kind of over in that area. Starts with a G.
Do you want to do Gewürztraminer, or do you want to do? Okay, great.
I don't know a lot about that one either. So
that's fun. Yeah, that's fun too.
Thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Food, Wine, and Whiskey in your own backyard. And until our next episode, enjoy your next pour.